Sometimes the quietest miracles arrive when a man has stopped believing anyone is coming. For Jack Miller, it happened on a rain-soaked night in the forests of Mount Hood, when a young German shepherd appeared at his remote ranger station, starving, injured, and alone. Jack took him in, cleaned his wounds, fed him by the fire, and told himself the dog would be gone once the storm passed. But the dog was not looking for shelter. Every morning he waited at the edge of the trees. Every morning he led Jack deeper into the mist, to hidden shelters, old military traces, and places that felt painfully familiar. Places tied to Ethan, the brother Jack lost 7 years ago after one missed phone call he could never forgive himself for. Why had this dog come to him now, and what secret was waiting in the rain-dark forest? Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe miracles can still find us in the storm. Rain had been falling over Mount Hood for 6 straight days, turning the pine forest silver with mist and making the roof of Ranger Station 9 tremble like an old drum. Jack Miller lived there alone, high in the wet green folds of Oregon, where the roads narrowed into mud, the radio crackled more than it spoke, and the forest seemed to swallow every human sound before it could travel far. At 47, Jack looked like a man carved by discipline rather than comfort. Tall, broad-shouldered, and lean in the hard, weathered way of someone who had spent more years carrying weight than setting it down. His face was angular, with a strong jaw usually covered by a short salt-and-brown beard, a crooked nose that had been broken once during training and never properly fixed, and gray-blue eyes that studied the world as if every shadow might be hiding a threat. He kept his dark hair cut short, not because he cared about appearances, but because old habits from the Navy had roots as stubborn as mountain trees. To the few people in the nearest town of Sandy, Jack was polite, reliable, and distant. He could fix a washed-out trail, guide a lost hiker home, or pull a truck from a ditch without making anyone feel foolish, but he never stayed for coffee afterward. He answered questions with the minimum number of words, nodded instead of smiling, and carried kindness like a pocket knife, useful, hidden, and only opened when necessary. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught him that emotions were dangerous when storms came fast and decisions had to be clean. Later, when the missions ended and silence became louder than gunfire, he had brought that rule into civilian life and locked himself inside it. The ranger station suited him. It was small, weather-beaten, and honest. There were maps on the walls, emergency supplies stacked with military precision, a wood stove that coughed before it warmed, and a narrow bunk beside a window streaked with rain. There were no family photographs, no bright curtains, no souvenirs from a life before the mountains. Only one personal object remained, an old black cell phone with a cracked screen kept in the top drawer of the desk. It had no service plan anymore, no purpose anyone else would understand, yet Jack checked it every night before bed, touching it once with 2 fingers as if confirming the presence of a wound. 7 years earlier, that phone had held the last missed call from his younger brother, Ethan Miller. Ethan had been 35 then, 5 years younger than Jack, slimmer, quicker to smile, and softer in the eyes despite having served in uniform himself. Where Jack was granite, Ethan had been river water, restless, bright in certain light, always trying to move around whatever hurt him rather than admit it was there. He had dark blonde hair that never stayed neat, a narrow face with tired blue eyes, and an easy humor that made strangers trust him faster than Jack thought wise. But after returning from service, Ethan changed. Crowds made him tense. Sudden noises stole the color from his face. He drifted between jobs, slept poorly, and apologized too often, as if his very existence took up space he had no right to claim. Jack had seen the signs, but he had mistaken them for weakness that could be cured by structure. He offered advice when Ethan needed shelter. He offered silence when Ethan needed someone to stay. Then came the call. Jack had been on a flood patrol when Ethan rang, rain hammering so hard on the truck roof that the world beyond the windshield blurred into gray. By the time Jack saw the missed call, hours had passed. The voicemail was short. Ethan's voice sounded thin, exhausted, almost embarrassed. He said he needed a few days somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would ask questions. Jack told himself he would call back in the morning. Morning brought a landslide report, then a missing hiker search, then another storm. By the time he tried, Ethan was gone. The official search lasted weeks. Hope lasted longer, though Jack never admitted it. After 18 months, Ethan was declared missing and presumed dead somewhere in the mountains. Jack signed the papers, thanked the officers, and returned to Ranger Station 9 with the expression of a man accepting weather. But grief did not leave him. It simply learned his schedule. Each morning he woke at 5 o'clock, logged rainfall, checked the generator, cleared drainage trenches, and walked the tree line with his hood up and his rifle slung across his back. Each night he listened to rain crawl down the walls and wondered, in the private courtroom of his own heart, whether one returned call could have changed a life. Outside, the Oregon forest breathed in fog and shadow. Inside, Jack Miller sat alone beneath the tapping roof, surrounded by maps of places he knew how to survive, and haunted by the one road he had never followed in time. The 7th night of rain came down harder than all the others, pounding Mount Hood until the forest seemed to groan under the weight of water and darkness. Jack Miller heard the storm change before he saw anything. It was a small shift, the kind only a man who had spent half his life listening for danger would notice. Rain striking wood, wind dragging branches across the roof, then beneath it all, a faint scrape against the porch boards. He sat still at the desk inside Ranger Station 9, one hand resting near the weather log, the other near the old drawer where Ethan's cracked phone lay like a buried relic. For a moment, Jack told himself it was nothing more than a loose branch or a raccoon driven close by the storm. The mountains were full of little sounds that wanted to become ghosts if a man let them. But then the scrape came again, followed by a soft, wet thud against the door. Jack rose without hurry, though his pulse had already sharpened. He crossed the room, lifted the rifle from beside the stove, and looked through the narrow window beside the entrance. At first, all he saw was rain. It sheeted sideways across the porch, silver in the dim yellow light, turning the world beyond the railing into a moving wall. Then a shape separated itself from the storm. A young German shepherd stood on the porch, soaked to the skin. Thin legs braced against the wind as if the mountain itself had tried to push him away and failed. He was not fully grown, perhaps 10 or 11 months old enough to have the long frame and intelligent face of his breed, but still unfinished in the paws, still too narrow through the chest, still carrying the awkward nobility of youth. His coat was black and tan, though the tan had dulled beneath mud, and the black saddle along his back clung in dark, wet ridges. One ear stood tall and alert, while the other bent slightly at the tip, giving him an expression that might have been comic on a brighter night. But there was nothing comic about his eyes. They were amber, steady, and strangely calm, not pleading, not wild, watching. Jack did not open the door right away. Habit held him there. A dog appearing alone during a storm could mean many things. A lost camper, an injured owner nearby, bait for someone desperate or foolish enough to use kindness against caution. Jack scanned the tree line beyond the porch, the sloping trail already bleeding mud, the drainage ditch swollen and rushing. No flashlight, no voice, no human shape, only rain, mist, and the dog standing exactly in the center of the porch as if he had chosen that place with intention. Jack unlocked the door. Wind shoved it inward before he could pull, carrying cold rain across the floorboards. The dog did not bolt inside. He did not lower his head or wag his tail. He stayed where he was, trembling now that the door was open. His body betraying a weakness his eyes refused to admit. "You picked a miserable night," Jack said, his voice low and rough from disuse. The dog blinked once. Jack stepped back. "Come on, then." Only then did the German shepherd move. He crossed the threshold slowly, favoring his right front paw, and paused just inside as if waiting for permission to exist in the room. Water streamed from his fur, pooling beneath him. Up close, Jack saw how bad it really was. The animal's ribs were visible beneath the wet coat, not skeletal but too clear. There was a cut along his left shoulder where something sharp had torn through fur and skin. His paw pads were cracked raw from stone and cold mud, and a shallow scrape ran down one hind leg. He wore a narrow leather collar, dark with rain, old enough that the edges had softened and cracked. Attached to it was a small rectangular metal tag, the military kind, not a pet store charm, dulled by weather and swinging against his chest. Jack noticed it, then looked away too quickly. He told himself tags like that were common. Men kept them, lost them, reused them on packs, collars, key rings, memories they did not know what else to do with. Jack shut the door and leaned the rifle back against the wall. The station felt smaller with another living thing inside it. The stove cracked and breathed orange light across the floor, and the dog stood in the middle of that glow, dripping, silent, and impossibly patient. "Sit," Jack said, not as a command, but as a test. The dog sat. The movement was stiff and painful, but immediate. Jack's brow tightened. This was not a wild stray. This dog had been trained by someone, or had loved someone enough to learn the shape of obedience. Jack fetched an old towel from the supply shelf, moving slowly, keeping his shoulders relaxed. Injured animals were honest, and honesty could still bite. But the shepherd did not flinch when Jack crouched beside him. He watched the man's hands, then his face as if making a decision of his own. Jack began drying him, first the head, then the neck, then the ribs, feeling the tremors running under the wet fur. There was strength there, buried under hunger and weather. There was endurance, too, the kind that came from surviving more than one bad night. "Where did you come from?" Jack murmured. The dog's bent ear twitched. Jack cleaned the shoulder wound with warm water and antiseptic. The shepherd's jaw tightened, and once he released a small breath through his nose, but he did not cry out. Jack had seen men with less control. That thought landed too close to memory, so he pushed it aside and focused on the work. Gauze, wrap, pressure, paw pads cleaned and coated, a folded blanket dragged near the stove. When he set down water, the dog drank slowly, stopping twice to look up at Jack as though expecting the bowl to vanish. When Jack offered a small portion of emergency kibble mixed with dried meat, the dog waited until Jack stepped back before eating. Not greedily, carefully. A survivor conserving what hope had given him. Jack stood by the table and watched, arms folded, rain hammering the windows behind him. The room smelled of wet fur, smoke, antiseptic, and coffee gone cold. It should have annoyed him. Instead, some part of the station seemed to settle around the dog, as if the empty corners had remembered an older purpose. The shepherd finished eating and limped toward the blanket, but before lying down, he turned his head. The metal tag shifted, catching firelight for half a second. Jack saw the letters beneath the grime. He did not move. The tag swung once more and disappeared into shadow. Jack crossed the room slowly, every step heavier than it should have been. He knelt beside the dog, who remained still, amber eyes lifted to him without fear. Jack reached for the tag. His fingers, steady through combat, cold, injury, and years of solitude, hesitated. Then he wiped mud from the metal with his thumb. 2 letters appeared, shallow but clear. E.M. The sound of the rain seemed to drop away. Jack stared at the initials until they stopped being letters and became a door he had spent 7 years holding shut. Ethan Miller. His brother's name rose in him with such force that for a moment he could not breathe. He told himself it meant nothing. Initials were accidents. Metal traveled. Dogs wandered. The world was full of cruel little coincidences with no message behind them. But the dog kept looking at him, calm and watchful, as if he had crossed miles of storm not to be saved, but to deliver something Jack was not ready to receive. Jack let go of the tag and stood too quickly. The shepherd lowered his head to the blanket, exhausted at last, but his eyes stayed open. Jack turned toward the desk, toward the drawer that held the old phone. He did not open it. Not yet. Outside, thunder rolled across Mount Hood, deep and ancient, like the voice of a god clearing his throat. Inside, Jack Miller stood between the dog and the past, and for the first time in 7 years, the locked room inside his heart was no longer silent. By morning, the storm had spent most of its fury, leaving Mount Hood wrapped in a white-gray mist so thick the trees looked less like trees than old sentinels standing behind a veil. Jack Miller woke before the alarm, though he had hardly slept. The station was quiet except for the soft hiss of rain dripping from the eaves and the occasional shift of the young German shepherd near the stove. The dog had survived the night with the disciplined stillness of a soldier in recovery. He lay on the folded blanket Jack had given him, front paw bandaged, shoulder wrapped cleanly, ribs rising and falling in a slower rhythm than the night before. In the dim blue light before dawn, the animal looked both young and ancient. A narrow-chested black and tan shepherd with long legs still too large for his body, amber eyes too patient for a creature not yet fully grown, and one bent ear that made him seem almost boyish until he looked at Jack as if he knew every grief in the room. Jack stood beside the stove, coffee untouched in his hand, and watched those eyes open. There was no panic in them, no question either, only purpose. That bothered Jack more than fear would have. Fear had rules. Purpose had direction. He told himself he would take the dog into town once the access road cleared. He would call animal control, check for a microchip, ask around the farms east of Sandy, do everything a responsible ranger was supposed to do. The thought should have settled him. Instead, it felt like a lie dressed in official language. The initials on the metal tag had followed him through the night. EM. 2 letters, nothing more. Yet they had moved around inside his skull like boots in an empty hallway. Ethan Miller. Ethan laughing with mud on his face after a failed camping trip. Ethan standing too still at a 4th of July parade when fireworks cracked overhead. Ethan's voice on the voicemail, thin and ashamed, asking for a few quiet days. Jack poured the coffee into the sink without tasting it. When he opened the door to step outside, the German shepherd rose. The movement was careful, stiff around the injured shoulder, but determined. Jack turned. "No," he said quietly. "You stay." The dog did not obey this time. He limped to the threshold and stood beside him, rain-glossed light catching the old collar at his neck. Jack looked down at him for a long moment, then out toward the forest where fog hung low between the firs. The sensible choice was to close the door. The choice he made was to pull on his rain shell, shoulder his pack, and step onto the porch. The dog followed without waiting for permission. At the edge of the clearing, the shepherd stopped. He did not bark or paw at the ground. He simply turned his head, met Jack's gaze once, and walked into the mist. There was something almost insulting in the calmness of it, as if the dog had never doubted Jack would come. Jack followed with a ranger's caution and a veteran's suspicion, placing each boot carefully on the waterlogged ground. The storm had changed the forest overnight. Small streams cut across old paths. Ferns sagged beneath beads of rain. The trunks of Douglas firs rose black and wet from the earth, their tops vanishing into cloud. Every sound seemed near and far at once, dripping branches, shifting mud, the low murmur of runoff beneath roots. The dog moved slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because he was wounded and wise enough not to waste strength. He chose ground that held. He skirted loose slopes where the mud had softened. He crossed shallow washes at places where stones lay hidden beneath the water. Jack noticed all of it. A stray dog might wander. This dog was navigating. The first sign appeared less than half a mile from the station, beyond a fallen hemlock split by lightning years ago. The shepherd stopped near a patch of exposed earth beneath a shelf of roots. Jack almost missed it. Then he saw the impression, a boot print, half filled with rain pressed into clay that had dried once and softened again. It was old, not from last night, maybe not even from this season, but the sole pattern was familiar enough to make Jack's chest tighten. Military tread, worn at the heel. the kind of print made by a boot kept long after regulations stopped mattering. Jack crouched, careful not to touch the edge. The forest around him seemed to lean closer. One print meant nothing. Hunters bought surplus boots. Hikers wore anything. But the dog stood beside the mark and watched Jack, not the forest, as if waiting for recognition to do its work. Jack rose without speaking. The shepherd turned and moved on. They climbed through a corridor of spruce where mist collected in pale ribbons, and the trail, if it could be called a trail, narrowed until branches brushed Jack's shoulders. He had patrolled this region before, but not often. It sat between mapped routes, a wet, inconvenient fold of land where people rarely went unless they had a reason to avoid easier ground. The second sign hung at eye level, a short length of green paracord tied around a young cedar, the knot tight, practical, and weathered nearly black. Jack touched it with 2 fingers. The knot was not decorative. It was a marker, the kind a man might leave for himself if he intended to return without being noticed. Jack remembered teaching Ethan that knot in their father's garage years before the military took either of them. Ethan had learned it fast, then tied Jack's bootlaces together under the workbench and laughed until their mother threatened to make both of them sleep outside. The memory struck with such sudden warmth that Jack almost smiled. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold weight of possibility. By midday, the rain thinned into mist and the dog led him toward a rock overhang tucked above a narrow creek. The place was invisible from below, hidden by salal and dripping ferns. Under the stone lip, Jack found ash scattered in a shallow ring. Not fresh, not accidental either. Whoever had built the fire had kept it small, shielded from sight, fed with dry inner wood stripped from deadfall. Nearby lay a blackened strip of tin folded into a crude reflector. Jack stared at it, feeling old training and older guilt speak the same language. A lost tourist built a fire for warmth. A man, hiding, built one like this. The dog lowered himself carefully onto his haunches, resting his injured paw but keeping his eyes on the woods. He did not sniff the ash. He did not celebrate discovery. He had known it was there. The final sign came as the light began to fade early behind the clouds. The shepherd angled toward a cluster of wind-bent cedars where the ground rose in a shallow hump above the creek. There, snagged beneath a root and half-eaten by weather, was a strip of cloth. Jack pulled it free gently. It had once been white, perhaps gauze, perhaps part of an undershirt cut into a bandage. The fabric was stiff, stained brown in places, and frayed along one edge by a knife rather than torn by chance. Jack held it in his palm while the rain tapped softly on his hood. He saw Ethan again, not dead, not smiling, but sitting somewhere in this forest with shaking hands, cutting fabric because something had gone wrong and no one was coming. Jack's throat tightened. He wanted to be angry at the woods, at the dog, at Ethan, at the cruel patience of time. Instead, he folded the cloth and placed it back under the root, as if disturbing it too much might break the thin thread it had left behind. They returned to Ranger Station 9 near dusk, both moving slower than when they had left. The dog's limp had deepened, and Jack hated himself for noticing too late. Inside, he unwrapped the bandage, cleaned the paw again, and gave the animal a larger portion of food than protocol would recommend. The shepherd accepted it with solemn dignity, as though he and Jack had entered into an agreement neither of them understood. Jack sat at the desk long after the stove warmed the room. The old phone remained in the drawer. The map of Mount Hood hung on the wall in front of him, full of lines he trusted and blank spaces he had ignored. Today, the dog had led him into one of those blank spaces and shown him a boot print, a cord marker, a hidden fire, and a ruined bandage. Small things, denial-sized things, but together they formed a sentence Jack could no longer pretend not to read. Somewhere in the misted forest, Ethan had left traces, and the dog had come to show him where to begin. The mist did not lift the next morning. It only thinned, drifting between the cedars like smoke from a fire the forest refused to confess. Jack Miller stood on the porch of Ranger Station 9 with his pack already buckled and his jaw set hard enough to ache. He had spent most of the night awake, staring at the map on the wall, seeing not marked trails but the empty places between them, those damp green hollows where a man could disappear if he knew enough about weather, hunger, and shame. The German shepherd waited below the steps, no longer limping as badly, though his front paw still carried the careful stiffness of pain. Rain had darkened the black saddle of his coat and left the tan fur along his legs clumped in thin spikes. He looked younger in the morning light, all narrow chest and long bones, yet his amber eyes had the grave patience of something older than both of them. Jack had not named him. Naming meant claiming, and claiming meant admitting the dog had not simply wandered in from the storm. Still, when the shepherd turned toward the trees, Jack followed without pretending it was a patrol. They moved east this time, away from the places they had searched the day before. The forest changed subtly as they descended into a lower fold of land where old cedars grew thicker and darker, their trunks wide enough to make a man feel temporary. Moss hung from branches in green curtains. The ground softened beneath Jack's boots, layered with wet needles, rotten leaves, and black earth that smelled of age. The dog did not pause at every sound now. He moved with a quiet certainty, choosing a path through ferns and fallen limbs as if reading a map written in scent, memory, and grief. Jack kept his eyes open for signs. Another boot print, a cut branch, a knot of cord, but the forest offered nothing obvious. That made him uneasy. Yesterday's traces had spoken in fragments. Today, the silence felt deliberate. They walked nearly 2 miles before the shepherd slowed. Ahead, the trees formed a small natural hollow, a windless pocket beneath 3 ancient western red cedars whose roots rose from the ground like the backs of sleeping beasts. The canopy above was so dense that the rain arrived there only as slow, fat drops falling long after the clouds had spent them. Jack stopped at the edge of the hollow. His breath fogged faintly. The air felt warmer here, stiller, as though the place had been holding itself apart from the rest of the mountain. The shepherd stepped forward, lowered his head, and sniffed the ground near the largest cedar. Then he began to dig. It was not frantic. That was what chilled Jack. The dog's paws worked steadily through the wet leaves and mud, scraping aside layers with practiced determination. Mud sprayed against his legs. His bandage darkened almost immediately, but he did not stop. "Easy," Jack said, though he did not know whether he was speaking to the dog or to the rising pressure inside his own chest. He crouched beside him and placed one hand lightly on the shepherd's shoulder. The dog paused just long enough to glance at him, then dug again. Jack swallowed. He had seen dogs dig before, for bones, for buried food, for the wild joy of being alive. This was none of those. This was memory with claws. Jack set his pack down and used his gloved hands to clear the mud more carefully. Beneath the leaves, the soil was packed harder than the surrounding ground, pressed down long ago and sealed by seasons of rain. His fingers struck a small root, then a flat stone, then something metal. The sound was faint, almost swallowed by the wet earth, but Jack knew it instantly. His whole body went still. The shepherd stepped back and sat, chest heaving, one bent ear tilted forward, eyes locked on Jack's hands. Jack brushed mud away from the object slowly, afraid of what haste might destroy, more afraid of what patience might reveal. A metal tag emerged first by one corner, dull and brown with age, its chain twisted around a root hair. Not the small tag on the dog's collar, a military dog tag. Jack worked it free with a care that bordered on reverence. The tag came loose at last and lay heavy in his palm, slick with mud, cold as a piece of moon. For several seconds he did not turn it over. He could hear the forest breathing around him, water dropping from cedar needles, the faint creak somewhere below, the dog's slow panting, his own heartbeat behaving like a fist against a locked door. He wiped the tag against his sleeve. Letters appeared beneath the grime, shallow but unmistakable. Ethan Miller. The name broke something in him without making a sound. Jack sank back onto his heels, then sat hard in the mud as if his legs had simply forgotten their duty. The tag rested in his open hand. 7 years of denial, discipline, paperwork, patrols, and cold mornings collapsed into that small rectangle of metal. Ethan had been here. Not as a rumor, not as a memory, not as a name whispered by officials in a room too bright for mercy. Here, beneath these cedars, breathing this wet air, touching this ground, choosing this hollow because it was hidden from wind and hard to see from the slope. Jack pressed his free hand into the mud until cold seeped through the glove. He remembered Ethan at 19, grinning beside an old pickup after changing a tire wrong twice before getting it right. He remembered Ethan at 30, quieter after deployment, standing near the edge of family gatherings as if laughter had become a language he could no longer speak fluently. He remembered the voicemail, that thin voice asking for quiet, and the terrible arrogance with which Jack had believed morning would wait for him. The German shepherd moved closer, but did not touch him. That restraint, that almost human respect, nearly undid Jack more than comfort would have. Jack looked at the young dog and finally allowed himself to see what he had resisted since the storm. This animal was not lost. He had not arrived by accident, had not chosen Ranger Station 9 because of warmth or food alone. He had come carrying a path. Maybe Ethan had owned him. Maybe Ethan had saved him. Maybe they had survived together long enough for loyalty to become a compass. Jack did not know yet, but he knew the dog had led him here with intention, to a place Ethan had marked not for strangers, but for someone who might understand. Jack closed his fingers around the tag and held it against his chest. The old grief inside him changed shape. It did not become lighter. It became sharper, clearer. No longer a fog, but a blade pointing forward. "You knew," he said softly. The shepherd blinked, rain clinging to his whiskers, amber eyes steady. Jack almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because the world had chosen the strangest messenger imaginable. A half-grown dog with mud on his nose and one foolishly bent ear, standing beneath ancient cedars like a small knight sent by a forgotten king. Jack wiped his face with the back of his wrist, though whether it was rain or something else he refused to inspect. He searched the hollow carefully after that, but found no body, no pack, no fresh sign of life. Only the shape of a place once used by someone who had known how to hide from weather and people alike. A shallow depression beneath a root could have held a sleeping bag. A line of stones near the trunk might at once have kept gear above the mud. A broken cedar branch had been cut cleanly years ago, angled to drain rainwater away from a resting place. Ethan had not simply passed through. He had stayed here, at least for a while. He had endured. That realization hurt in a different way, because it carried a terrible question. If Ethan had survived here, where had he gone next? Jack tucked the tag inside the inner pocket of his jacket, close to the old place where duty and love had fought too late. The shepherd rose when Jack did. His injured paw trembled, but he stood ready, waiting for the next command that Jack had not yet learned how to give. Jack looked once more at the cedar hollow, at the wet earth disturbed by their hands and paws, at the ancient roots holding their secrets with the patience of mountains. Then he turned back toward the station. He understood now that the dog was not asking him to solve a mystery from a chair, not inviting him to mourn over evidence and stop. The shepherd was leading him along Ethan's survival route, one hidden sign at a time, and Jack, who had missed one call 7 years ago, would not ignore this one. For the next 3 days, Jack Miller stopped pretending the walks were patrols. He packed like a man preparing for a rescue he had never been officially allowed to continue. Rope, thermal blankets, medical tape, water purification tablets, a compact flare, extra food, a folding saw, and an old field notebook he had not opened since the last winter search for Ethan ended in silence. The German shepherd waited each morning at the edge of the porch, his injured paw cleaner now, though still stiff when the cold settled into it. Rain had eased into a steady mountain drizzle, the kind that did not announce danger with thunder, but slowly soaked through every seam, every sleeve, every doubt. Jack tightened the straps on his pack, looked once toward the drawer where Ethan's old phone remained untouched, then followed the dog into the trees. The shepherd moved differently now, as if the discovery beneath the cedar had changed the agreement between them. He no longer glanced back as often. He trusted Jack to come. That trust irritated Jack at first, then humbled him, because trust had always been Ethan's most dangerous talent. They descended along a wet ridgeline where the moss grew thick over fallen logs and the fog gathered in the low places like breath held by the earth. The dog led with slow precision, choosing routes that curved around exposed slopes and avoided ground softened by runoff. Jack began to see the forest not as a ranger saw it, marked by boundaries and maintenance routes, but as a hidden architecture of survival. Water here, cover there, windbreak above, sightline below. It was a language Ethan would have understood. The first place they reached that morning lay beneath a tilted wall of basalt, almost invisible behind ferns and salal. The shepherd stopped at the entrance and lowered his head. Jack pushed aside the wet branches and found a shelter built so carefully that grief rose in him before surprise. Dead limbs had been stacked against the rock to form a low lean-to, roofed with strips of bark and an old sheet of plastic darkened by seasons. The back wall was stone, the floor raised with cedar boughs long since flattened into a brown mat. It was not comfortable. It was smart. It held heat. It kept a man dry enough to live. Jack crouched inside, touching nothing at first. He could picture Ethan there with awful clarity. Shoulders hunched, knees drawn up, listening to rain hit the plastic while trying to decide whether tomorrow was worth reaching. Near the entrance, tucked beneath a stone, Jack found a small tin cup, dented along the rim, its handle bent inward. He knew it immediately. Ethan had carried that cup on every childhood camping trip, claiming coffee tasted braver from ugly metal. Jack had mocked him for keeping it. Ethan had grinned and said beautiful things were usually too fragile for real life. Jack held the cup for a long moment, thumb resting on the dent. His anger, which had survived 7 years by disguising itself as discipline, weakened. Ethan had not vanished into nothing. He had carried old things with him. He had carried memory. They moved on before the light shifted too low, the dog leading them toward a creek hidden beneath alder branches. There, Jack found another pause point, cleverer than the first. A dry notch between two roots, just large enough for a man to sit with his back protected and his eyes on the water. A line of stones had been placed where a small fire could burn without sending smoke straight upward. Beside it lay fragments of gray thermal fabric, cut into strips with a blade, the edges neat despite rot and damp. Jack lifted one piece and saw old brown staining near the middle. Bandage. Not panic. Not desperation alone. Improvisation. Ethan had been hurt out here and had treated himself, maybe more than once. Jack remembered the way his brother used to hide pain with jokes, smiling through split knuckles, fever, heartbreak, anything that might make someone worry. Suddenly, Jack understood something that had evaded him for years. Ethan had not disappeared because he wanted the world to suffer for losing him. He had disappeared because being seen had become its own kind of pain. The thought settled heavily, like rainwater collecting in a boot. The shepherd sat near the creek, watching Jack with those steady amber eyes, young body still and solemn. Mud darkened his paws and his bent ear twitched each time water moved beneath the roots. Jack wondered how long the dog had known these places. Had Ethan raised him from a pup out here? Had the animal found Ethan later, two lost creatures making a kingdom out of rain, scraps, and stubborn breath? The answer was somewhere ahead, but not yet within reach. On the second day, they found a south-facing slope where the trees opened enough for pale winter sun to touch the ground. There were no dramatic signs there, only small decisions made by a man who understood cold. A sitting hollow lined with bark, a hidden cache of charred wood kept dry beneath stone, a strip of orange cloth tied high enough to be seen only from one narrow angle. Jack stood beneath it and felt his professional mind assemble the pattern. Ethan had created a circuit, a chain of places close enough to reach when weak, hidden enough to avoid strangers, practical enough to survive bad weather. It was not madness, it was method. That realization hurt worse than if the signs had been chaotic. If Ethan had been capable of planning all this, then he had also been capable of choosing not to come home. Jack wanted that to feel like betrayal. Instead, beneath the old fury, he felt the first dangerous movement of understanding. On the third day, rain returned harder, drumming on leaves and turning the soil slick. Jack slipped once on a root and caught himself with one hand, cursing under his breath. The dog stopped, came back, and stood beside him until he rose. There was no judgment in the animal's face. Jack almost laughed. "Don't start," he muttered. The shepherd blinked, dignified as a priest and twice as muddy. For the first time in months, maybe years, Jack felt humor pass through him without guilt. It faded quickly, but it had been there. They climbed to a narrow overlook above a bend in the creek. Below, fog rolled through the valley, hiding and revealing the water in slow breaths. The dog settled near a fallen log, not pointing to an object this time, not digging, not searching, just waiting. Jack looked around and understood. This was not a camp. It was a watch place. From here, a man could see movement below while remaining nearly invisible above. A man could decide whether to approach a hiker, avoid a ranger, or simply sit with the terrible freedom of being unfound. Jack lowered himself onto the log. His pack pressed against his spine. His knees ached. His heart felt older than his body. He thought of Ethan sitting here, perhaps with the tin cup warm in his hands, perhaps with the dog as a younger pup pressed against his side, watching the world pass below and unable to step back into it. Jack had spent 7 years believing his brother had either died quickly or abandoned him completely. Both versions had allowed anger to remain simple, but the forest had ruined that mercy. Ethan had survived. Ethan had struggled. Ethan had made shelter, treated wounds, marked routes, chosen water, conserved fire, and kept going through seasons no one had witnessed. Jack's anger loosened, not because it was wrong, but because it was too small for the truth. Ethan had not left because he hated Jack. He had left because the road back to people had become steeper than any mountain trail. The shepherd shifted closer and leaned his shoulder against Jack's leg. It was a small pressure, warm through wet fabric. Jack rested one gloved hand on the dog's back, fingers sinking into damp fur. "I should have come sooner," he said, the words barely louder than the rain. The dog did not answer. He did not need to. By dusk, they returned to Ranger Station 9 with no final answer, no body, no living brother standing in the trees. But Jack carried more than evidence now. He carried a map made of Ethan's choices, and for the first time he was beginning to read it not as accusation, but as testimony. Ethan had lived. Ethan had endured. And somewhere beyond the next ridge the path continued. The rain returned in the late afternoon with the weight of something ancient, turning Mount Hood's slopes slick and treacherous, as if the mountain had decided to move beneath Jack Miller's boots. By then, Jack and the German shepherd had been on the trail for hours, following the hidden logic of Ethan's survival route through cedar shadows, soaked ferns, and narrow animal paths where the earth gave way if stepped on carelessly. Jack had grown used to the dog's quiet intelligence over the past days, but that afternoon something changed. The shepherd, still young and lean beneath his damp black and tan coat, suddenly stopped on a ridge above a safe descent and lifted his head into the rain. His bent ear twitched. His amber eyes sharpened. Then, without warning, he turned away from the route back to Ranger Station 9 and plunged down a narrow side trail half hidden by blackberry vines and mud. "No," Jack said, too late. The dog was already moving, not recklessly, but with an urgency Jack had never seen in him before. Jack followed, boots sliding, one hand catching roots and wet stone, his pack dragging against his shoulders. Below them, somewhere out of sight, the sound of water had changed from a creek's whisper to a violent rush. A landslide had torn through the slope, carving fresh wounds into the earth. Mud, broken branches, and chunks of basalt had collapsed into a narrow ravine, creating a chute of brown water and shattered timber. Jack cursed under his breath. He knew terrain like this. It killed quietly. It looked passable until one wrong step sent a man down into rock and flood. The shepherd disappeared around a bend, then barked once, the first sharp sound Jack had heard from him since the night he arrived. That bark struck Jack harder than thunder. He slid the last few yards on his side, digging his heels into the slope to slow himself, and landed in knee-deep mud near the ravine floor. The dog stood ahead beside a twisted pile of branches and stone, body rigid, tail low, head pointed toward something wedged beneath a slab of rock. At first, Jack saw only torn blue tarp, nearly gray from age and rain, its edge snapping weakly in the wind. Then he saw a boot. Not upright, not moving. Half buried under mud. Jack's body became very still. Training took over before fear could. He dropped his pack, crossed the last few feet, and began clearing debris with both hands. The tarp had been wrapped around a human shape, pinned but not crushed beneath fallen branches and loose stone. Jack cut through the tarp with his knife, peeled it back, and found the face beneath. Ethan Miller looked like a ghost the forest had borrowed and forgotten to return. He was thinner than Jack remembered, frighteningly so, his cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin, dark blonde hair tangled and wet beneath a ruined knit cap. A patchy beard covered his jaw, streaked with dirt and rain, and the lines around his eyes seemed too deep for 30-something, as though 7 years had carved weather directly into him. But his lips moved. Barely. A faint breath escaped into the cold air. Alive. For one impossible second, Jack forgot every procedure he had ever learned. The world narrowed to Ethan's face, to the brother he had buried in his mind without a grave, to the boy who used to laugh over a dented tin cup, and the man who had vanished into silence. Then Jack forced himself back. "Ethan," he said, voice low, nearly broken. No response. Jack checked the airway, cleared mud from the side of Ethan's mouth, tilted his head carefully, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse. Weak, slow, but there. Severe hypothermia. Exposure, dehydration, possible infection, no obvious catastrophic bleeding. Jack moved with ruthless care because tenderness alone would not keep Ethan alive. He slid a thermal blanket under him as far as he could, cut away wet outer layers, wrapped him in insulation, and used chemical heat packs near the core, not the limbs, forcing himself to remember slow warmth, controlled warmth, no panic. The German shepherd paced once, trembling, then settled against Ethan's side as if he understood exactly what his body could offer. His narrow chest pressed to Ethan's ribs, his wet fur steaming faintly beneath the blanket Jack pulled over both of them. "Good boy," Jack whispered, and the words surprised him because they sounded like gratitude, prayer, and apology all at once. Rain hammered the ravine walls, mud continued to slide in small streams. Jack knew he could not carry Ethan out alone, not up that slope, not with the water rising and the ground still unstable. He pulled the emergency beacon from his pack and activated it, then fired a flare through a gap in the ravine canopy when the clouds thinned for half a breath. Red light hissed upward, a small human star against the gray. Then he waited, checking Ethan's pulse every few minutes, adjusting the blanket, pressing his own body close enough to block the wind without jarring him. "You don't get to leave now," Jack muttered, though Ethan could not hear him. "Not after making me walk all over this cursed mountain." The absurdity of the sentence might have made Ethan smile once. Jack held on to that thought like a match in rain. Nearly 40 minutes later, voices cut through the storm above the ravine. The local SAR team arrived in bright wet gear, ropes slung over shoulders, helmets streaked with mud. Their leader descended first, Sarah Bennett, the county's search and rescue commander. She was in her early 40s, tall and rangy rather than bulky, with strong shoulders, long legs, and the steady balance of someone who had crossed bad ground since childhood. Her skin was lightly browned and weather-marked, her dark auburn hair braided tight beneath a red helmet, and her green eyes had a sharp, assessing calm that could cut through panic without becoming cold. Sarah was known in the mountain communities as firm, practical, and almost impossible to impress. Years earlier, she had lost a volunteer rescuer during a winter flood, and since then she trusted preparation more than luck and clear orders more than comforting speeches. She reached Ethan, took in Jack's work with one swift glance, and nodded. "You bought him time," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, and steady enough to make the ravine feel less like a trap. 2 rescuers followed, a broad young man with rain running off his blonde beard and a quiet woman with brown skin, black curls tucked under her helmet, and hands that moved quickly over medical gear. They did not waste words. Sarah checked Ethan's vitals, secured a cervical collar as precaution, and coordinated the rope system while Jack kept one hand near Ethan's shoulder, unwilling to step back until ordered. The shepherd growled softly when the team lifted Ethan onto the rescue litter, not from aggression, but from terror that the person he had guarded might be taken away again. Jack placed a firm hand on the dog's neck. "Easy," he said, and this time the dog obeyed, though his amber eyes never left Ethan. Sarah glanced at the animal, then at Jack. Something softened in her face for half a second. "He found him?" she asked. Jack nodded once. Sarah accepted that as if mountains often chose strange messengers. The team raised Ethan inch by inch through the ravine, ropes tightening, boots slipping, commands passing cleanly through rain. Jack climbed after them, one hand on the shepherd's collar to guide him over the worst sections. At the rim, as the rescue crew prepared to move Ethan toward the waiting transport point, Jack saw his brother's face once more beneath the thermal wrap, pale, still, but alive. The dog pressed against Jack's leg, shaking from cold and exhaustion. Sarah gave the final signal, and the litter moved out through the rain, carrying Ethan away from the ravine that had almost become his grave. Jack stood there with mud on his hands, rain in his beard, and the young shepherd beside him, understanding at last that the mountain had not returned an answer. It had returned a chance. Ethan Miller survived the ravine, though survival came back to him slowly, like dawn climbing through a storm-washed forest one branch at a time. The county hospital in Hood River sat low against the gray foothills, a modest brick building with fogged windows, humming lights, and the faint smell of antiseptic that made Jack Miller feel more uneasy than any battlefield ever had. The mountains were honest when they tried to kill a man. Hospitals whispered, blinked, waited, and measured hope in numbers on a screen. Ethan lay in a narrow bed near the window, thinner than memory had any right to allow. His dark blonde hair washed and trimmed unevenly by a nurse who had done her best, his patchy beard shaved down to a rough shadow along a jaw that had once been softer, quicker to smile. His face was hollow, skin pale from cold and hunger, but the bones of him remained familiar. The same narrow nose, the same tired blue eyes, the same faint crease at the corner of his mouth that appeared when he was trying to turn pain into a joke and failing politely. Dr. Elaine Porter, the physician overseeing his recovery, was a small woman in her late 50s with silver hair pinned tightly behind her head, warm brown skin, square glasses, and a voice calm enough to make bad news sound survivable. She did not decorate the truth. Ethan had severe hypothermia, dehydration, malnutrition, and an infection that had nearly taken hold in his lungs. Recovery would be slow. There would be weakness, confusion, nightmares, and days when the body remembered the ravine even after the mind tried not to. But he was alive, and when Dr. Porter said that, Jack held on to the words as if they were rope. He visited every time the road allowed, driving down from Ranger Station 9 with mud still on his boots and Silence sitting beside him like an old passenger. At first, he did not know what to say. He sat in the chair near Ethan's bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped until the knuckles whitened, watching his brother sleep under hospital blankets that looked too thin for the kind of winter Ethan had survived. Sometimes Nurse Maria Alvarez came in to check the IV. She was a round-faced woman in her early 30s with black hair twisted into a loose bun, quick hands, and the soft humor of someone who had learned that frightened families needed gentleness more than speeches. "He knows you're here," she told Jack once. Jack only nodded, but after she left, he moved his chair closer. On the fourth visit, Ethan opened his eyes while rain tapped against the window. For a long moment, he stared at Jack as though trying to decide whether this was memory, fever, or mercy. Then his voice came out rough and thin. "You look old." Jack blinked, stunned by the absurd miracle of complaint. A sound escaped him, not quite laughter, not quite grief. "You look terrible." Ethan's mouth curved faintly. "Then we're even." That was the beginning. Not forgiveness, not explanation, not the grand speech Jack had rehearsed 100 times and abandoned 100 more. Just two brothers standing on opposite shores of 7 lost years, tossing one small joke across the water to see if it would float. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's strength returned by inches. He learned to sit up without shaking, then to stand with the walker, then to take slow steps down the hallway while Jack walked beside him pretending not to hover. Sarah Bennett visited twice, still tall and rain-browned and practical in her SAR jacket, her dark auburn braid falling over one shoulder, her green eyes sharp but less guarded outside the storm. She brought reports for Jack to sign and a bag of dog treats she claimed were official rescue equipment. Sarah was not a woman who softened easily. The loss of a volunteer years earlier had left her careful with hope, but when she saw Ethan upright, her smile came small and real. "Mountain gave you back," she said. Ethan, leaning heavily on the rail, answered, "It kept my security deposit." Even Sarah laughed at that, a short surprised laugh that made Jack look at her as though she had opened a window. The German Shepherd waited at the station during those hospital weeks, healing in his own quiet way. Jack drove back each evening to feed him, change his bandage, and find him sitting by the porch steps facing the road, one ear bent, one ear upright, his black and tan coat growing fuller now that food and warmth had begun their work. The dog never whined when Jack left again in the morning. He simply watched, patient as a monk and twice as muddy, as if he understood that some rescues continued even after the body was carried out. Jack still had not named him. The right name felt like a door that should open only when everyone was home. That day finally came beneath a pale, rinsed sky after 3 weeks of rain. Ethan returned to Ranger Station 9 wrapped in borrowed clothes, a wool cap pulled low over his uneven hair, his body thin inside the coat Jack had brought him. He moved slowly, one hand on the truck door, the other gripping Jack's arm with a weakness that made both men pretend to be interested in the gravel. The forest around them glistened. Water dropped from cedar needles. The roof of the station shone dark and clean. For the first time in years, Jack did not see the place as a bunker against the world. He saw it as a doorway. The shepherd stood on the porch, perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan. Ethan stopped at the bottom step, breath catching so quietly Jack almost missed it. "Hey," Ethan whispered. The dog came down one step, then another, not rushing, not leaping, as if he knew the body before him was made of glass and stubbornness. He reached Ethan and sat. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Ethan lowered himself with effort, one knee sinking into the wet earth, and extended a trembling hand. The shepherd leaned forward and placed his head into Ethan's palm, not dramatically, not like a trained trick, like a promise finally allowed to rest. Ethan closed his eyes. Jack turned his face toward the trees, giving his brother privacy he could not fully give himself. When he looked back, Ethan was crying without sound, and the dog was pressed against him, steady as a little guardian sent by some old forest god with muddy paws and no sense of personal space. Later, inside the station, Jack made coffee too strong for anyone's safety. Ethan sat near the stove with a blanket over his knees, and the shepherd lay between them as though he had always owned the place. Jack opened the desk drawer, took out the cracked phone, and set it on the table. He did not touch it like a wound this time. He looked at Ethan. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were plain, blunt, 7 years late, and still they arrived. Ethan stared at the phone, then at Jack. "I didn't know how to come back," he said. Jack nodded, because at last he understood. Outside, rain began again, softer now, almost kind. Jack looked down at the dog, whose bent ear twitched in sleep. "Scout," he said. The dog opened one amber eye. Ethan smiled faintly. "Good name." From that evening on, Ranger Station 9 was no longer a place built only for survival. It became a strange, imperfect home. One brother learning to speak before silence could harden again, another learning that being found did not mean being trapped, and a young German shepherd named Scout sleeping between them like the warm punctuation mark at the end of a long, unfinished prayer. The Oregon rain would return, as it always did, but it no longer sounded like loneliness on the roof. It sounded like the world washing itself clean. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, shining lights, or angels standing at the door. Sometimes they come quietly, soaked by the rain, tired from the journey, and walking on 4 faithful paws. Jack, Ethan, and Scout remind us that God often works through the smallest signs we almost ignore. A knock in the storm, a loyal animal's eyes, a path we are afraid to follow, or a second chance we thought was buried forever. In our everyday lives, many of us carry old regrets, unanswered calls, broken relationships, or silent prayers we think heaven has forgotten. But God sees the places where we are lost, even when no one else does. He can send hope through a stranger, through a memory, through a storm, or through one brave little soul who refuses to give up. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or tell us about a miracle, a pet, or a loved one you still carry in your heart. And if you believe stories like this can bring light into someone's lonely season, please subscribe to our channel and join this family of faith, kindness, and hope. May God bless you, protect your home, heal what is hurting inside you, and guide your steps gently, even when the road ahead is hidden by rain.